They want you to believe that 88 million bricks, thousands of tons of carved granite, and a 548-foot tower were assembled by men with ropes and horses over 30 years. Modern contractors with cranes and laser levels can't replicate it. But sure, the horses definitely figured it out. Take Philadelphia City Hall. Construction officially began in 1871 and finished in 1901, 30 years. The central tower stands 548 feet tall. At the top sits a bronze statue of William Penn, weighing 53,348 pounds. The building consumed 88 million bricks and thousands of tons of limestone, granite, and marble. The load-bearing masonry walls measure 22 feet thick at the base because there's no internal steel skeleton. I'm just stone, stacked stone. And according to the historical record, they did all of this with horses and hand tools, which is like saying you built your iPhone with a rock and some good intentions. But here's what they don't tell you. The construction photographs are still around. They show horse-drawn wagons transporting materials, workers using manual chisels and primitive scaffolding. Yet somehow, with this equipment, they created architectural precision that modern contractors with laser levels struggle to replicate. The timeline says 30 years. The logistics say it should have taken 300. Either the horses had engineering degrees nobody mentioned, or someone's leaving out a fairly important chapter of the instruction manual. Pretty sure those horses weren't unionized either, which explains a lot. And then there are the basements. Walk around any major city hall built between 1850 and 1900. Look at the ground floor. Now look lower. You'll notice something strange. Windows. Not small ventilation grates. Full-sized windows with decorative frames and proper fenestration. Except these windows are at ground level or below. Some are half buried. Others are completely underground. The official explanation is that these are window wells for basement ventilation. That makes sense for a cellar. It doesn't make sense for rooms with 12-foot ceilings, ornate trim work, and architectural details that match the upper floors. These weren't designed as basements. They were designed as ground floor rooms, unless the architects were planning for a future where everyone would shrink and live underground like hobbits. Which means either the architects were catastrophically incompetent or the ground level used to be somewhere else. Go to Chicago, New York, Boston, London, Paris. The pattern repeats. The architectural community calls this raised grade or street level adjustment and attributes it to 19th-century urban planning. They just casually decided to bury the ground floors of their most expensive buildings because it was more convenient than building new foundations. Does that sound like normal municipal planning? It's the architectural equivalent of hiding your mistakes under a rug. Except the rug is 50 feet of dirt. The official timeline exists. The photographs exist. But when you put them side by side, one of them is lying. Now let's talk about the tools. Because if you question the timeline, the first defense you'll hear is that technology existed. Steam drills were introduced in quarries in the 1880s. Pneumatic tools arrived in the 1890s. There's also documented evidence of what these tools did to the workers. The pneumatic shift caused a massive spike in silicosis among stonecutters. The dust destroyed their lungs. The medical records are full of men who expired before age 40 breathing powdered granite. So the good news is the technology existed. The bad news is it was basically a slow-motion health crisis with a side of fancy buildings. So yes, the tools existed, but they existed at the end of the construction timeline, not the beginning. Here's the problem with the technology defense. The official story wants you to believe the tools arrived just in time. How convenient. It's like ordering pizza and having it show up exactly when the movie starts. Except the movie is 30 years long and the pizza is a steam-powered crane. The Romans built massive stone structures 2,000 years ago using the polyspastos, a treadwheel crane that could lift 6,000 kilograms. By 1878, engineers had developed the Fairbairn steam crane with lifting capacity exceeding 350 tons. So the official story says, see, the technology was there. Except claiming you have the technology and actually using it during construction are two very different things. We have the tools, and we're actually using the tools, are separated by about 6 months and 4 missed deadlines. And the technology timeline doesn't explain what happened in San Francisco. The old San Francisco City Hall took 27 years to build. Then the earthquake hit at 1906. The building collapsed in seconds. When investigators examined the rubble, they found something disturbing. The walls were padded with sand and rubbish. The bricks were shoddy. The construction was fraudulent. The official explanation is that corrupt contractors cut corners. A 27-year grift. Were they all scams? Or did San Francisco just hire the one contractor who watched a YouTube tutorial and called it good enough? Here's what makes it interesting. The replacement San Francisco City Hall was completed in 3 years, 1913 to 1916. 3 years. The dome stands 307.5 feet tall. It's still standing today. The new building used 7,900 tons of structural steel. The old building was load-bearing masonry. No steel skeleton. Just stone, holding up stone. So why did the first one take 27 years and immediately fall apart, while the second took 3 years and it's still here? Either the technology explanation is backwards, or the first building wasn't actually built the way they claim. If you want to see more evidence that makes you question whether your ancestors could read a tape measure, hit subscribe. Otherwise, you'll just be stuck wondering why your city hall has fancy windows underground and no good explanation. Nothing says we totally built this legitimately, like taking 27 years to make a building that collapses, then speedrunning a better version in 3. That's not progress. Neither that's someone finally reading the original blueprints. Or maybe they finally hired someone who could read, period. And the pattern repeats globally. The ornate stone structures built during the mid to late 19th century have a disturbing habit of catastrophic failure. They burn, they collapse. And when they're replaced, the replacements are always simpler, faster, less ornate. But improved methods don't explain why it took longer to build the primitive versions than the advanced ones, unless the primitive versions weren't built during the timeline claimed, unless they were already there. Inherited from something that came before, something that had a name on the old maps. They called it Tartaria. You know, the empire that supposedly never existed but somehow appeared on maps for 300 years. Just a tiny 3th-century typo. Could happen to anyone. Pull up a map from the 16th century. Ortelius in 1570, Vischer in 1657. Look at northern Asia. It's not divided into modern nation-states. It's labeled Tartaria, or Grande Tartarie. A vast territory covering a third of the globe. The maps show cities, trade routes, borders. This was a documented empire. Then, sometime in the late 19th century, the name vanished. The official explanation is that Tartary was a European catch-all term that got replaced by more specific labels. It doesn't explain why an empire that supposedly existed for centuries left behind almost no historical records, no linguistic legacy, and no clear archaeological evidence, unless the evidence was systematically buried. Literally. Because when you want to hide an entire continent-spanning empire, you don't just burn the books, you bury the buildings and hope nobody notices the suspiciously fancy basements. The timeline doesn't match the tools don't match the achievements. And when you start pulling that thread, the entire official history starts unraveling. Because if the buildings are older than claimed, then the maps weren't wrong. They were showing something that used to exist, something that got erased from the historical record. And if you can erase an empire from the maps, you can erase anything, like my browser history, which is also very suspicious, which brings us to Chicago in 1893. The World's Columbian Exposition, the White City, 690 acres of neoclassical architecture rising from swamps in under 2 years. By May of 1893, 14 great buildings and over 200 total structures stood complete. The official story says they built all of this using staff, a mixture of powdered gypsum, cement, and jute fiber applied over wood frames to simulate marble. Temporary exhibition halls. Theatrical props. So basically they built Disneyland before Disneyland existed, but with more fake marble and fewer churros. Then you look at the photographs. Contemporary accounts describe the scene as theatrical unreality, but not because it looked fake, because it looked too real. The pillars had the weight and presence of marble. Geometric precision extended across hundreds of acres. 27 million people visited, and then, conveniently, most of it burned down in July of 1894. 1 year after opening. Nothing to see here, folks. Just a totally normal accidental fire that happened to consume 690 acres of suspicious architecture right on schedule. Modern exhibition centers take longer to build, and they're just big rectangles with air conditioning. But somehow, in the 1890s, using wood frames and plaster, they created structures that looked like they'd been standing for centuries. They hosted 27 million visitors, then destroyed most of it before anyone could examine the construction too closely. It's like baking the world's most elaborate cake, taking one photo, then smashing it with a hammer. Totally normal baker behavior. If these were just temporary exhibition halls, why did they need to look like they'd survived empires? Why make fake marble look so convincing that people couldn't tell the difference? The official story says theatrical props. The photographs show architectural marvels. One of them is lying. And then there's the power system. Nikola Tesla's alternating current system illuminated the White City with 93,000 incandescent lamps. At a time when most cities still use gas lighting, Chicago had buildings glowing like daytime at midnight. The conspiracy theory claims the White City utilized free wireless energy harvested from the atmospheric ether. Until you look at the architecture. Every major building had spires, domes, finals. The official explanation is that these are decorative. The alternative explanation is that they're functional, antennas, collectors. Because nothing says just decorative like a giant metal rod sticking out of every building pointing directly at the sky. But here's the catch. If the White City was just a temporary exhibition, why destroy it so quickly? The official story says the buildings were flammable and structurally unsound. But only one structure survived, the Palace of Fine Arts. Everything else? Gone. The official reason is safety. The alternative reason is evidence destruction. It's the 19th century version of deleting your hard drive before returning your work laptop. Because it's not just Chicago. Every major World's Fair from the late 19th and early 20th century follows the same pattern. Grand, ornate temporary structures. Millions of visitors. Then systematic destruction. Paris, Buffalo, St. Louis, San Francisco. The architecture appears, dazzles the public, and vanishes. The pattern suggests these weren't exhibitions of what we could build. They were exhibitions of what was already built, like a really expensive pop-up shop, except instead of selling overpriced candles, they're showing off stolen buildings. And if the White City was too perfect to be temporary, the star forts are too perfect to be defensive. You've seen them in aerial photographs, geometric star-shaped fortifications scattered across Europe, Asia, and the Americas. Perfect symmetry, precise angles. The official history dates them to the mid-15th century. Angled walls deflect cannonballs. Earth and brick absorb impact. From a military standpoint, they make perfect sense. From a construction standpoint, they're insane. Building one requires moving millions of cubic feet of earth, precise surveying across miles, and coordination between dozens of construction teams. Yeah, when somehow they built hundreds across multiple continents using Renaissance-era tools, which is like saying they organized a global construction project using carrier pigeons and vibes. Look at the star forts from above. The geometry isn't just functional, it's beautiful, mathematical. The shapes resemble cymatic patterns, the geometric forms that sound waves create in sand or water, which is where the theory goes completely off the rails. The conspiracy theory interprets star forts as power stations for a global energy grid. The antennas in the center collected atmospheric energy. The geometric earthworks channeled it. The whole system operated wirelessly. And yes, it sounds ridiculous, because if an advanced civilization had wireless energy, why build the infrastructure out of dirt? Right? An advanced civilization capable of geometric perfection across continents decided the best building material was mud. Because when you're engineering a global energy network, you definitely want it made from the same thing we use to stop cannonballs. That's like building a supercomputer out of Play-Doh because it's tactile. But here's what the conspiracy theorists get right. The star forts are too perfect. The mathematics is too precise. The global distribution is too uniform. If these were independently developed, you'd expect regional variation, different cultures, different needs, different solutions. Instead, you get the same geometric principles from Japan to the Netherlands to the Caribbean. That's not convergent evolution. That's a single source. Either military engineers shared blueprints across empires at war with each other, or someone built a global network before those empires existed. It's like finding the exact same IKEA furniture in every country before IKEA existed. Either everyone copied each other's homework, or someone's lying about when IKEA was founded. And if the forts tell one story, the cleanup tells another. Between 1897 and 1930, Seattle moved 50 million short tons of earth. They called it the Denny regrade. The official explanation is urban planning. Seattle was built on steep hills that made transportation difficult. So they decided to flatten them. They used hydraulic giants, water cannons that could pump 20 million gallons per day. The photographs show something surreal. Houses perched on isolated columns of earth called spite mounds, left behind by property owners who refused to sell. As the ground level dropped, their houses stayed at the original elevation. First floors became second floors. Basements became ground floors. It's the ultimate petty move. You want to lower my street? Fine. I'll just live on top of a geological middle finger. Moving mountains wasn't enough. They had to move the people, too. The Denny regrade was one of the most expensive civil engineering projects in American history. And it happened during the same decades that every other major city was conducting similar operations. Chicago raised its entire street level. Edinburgh and Paris have underground cities where the original street levels are now subterranean. The pattern suggests something global. If this was just city planning, why does it look like someone was desperately burying something? Say because nothing says normal civic improvement, like simultaneously burying your buildings and shipping off 250,000 kids. And then came the children. Between 1854 and 1929, the orphan trains relocated approximately 200,000 to 250,000 children from eastern cities to the Midwest and West. Charles Loring Brace and the Children's Aid Society organized the program to save children from slums and place them with families who needed farm labor. Which sounds noble until you realize 72% of these orphans had living parents. It's like redefining vegetarian to include people who sometimes think about vegetables. The program had no standardized record keeping. Children were stripped of their birth names and given new identities. Family histories were erased. And they weren't orphans. They were forcibly separated from their families. Peak humanitarian work really warms the heart, like arson. But the timing is what gives it away. The orphan trains operated from 1854 to 1929. The Denny regrade ran from 1897 to 1930. The World's Fairs destroyed Tartarian architecture from 1893 through the early 20th century, all cluster in the same 75-year window. The pattern suggests coordination. Bury the physical evidence under millions of tons of earth. Remove the human evidence by severing children from their families. Destroy architectural proof by burning the World's Fair buildings. You can't have witnesses if there's no one left who remembers. But here's what they couldn't erase: the maps themselves. See, it turns out it's hard to recall every single atlas printed in every library across 3 centuries. Whoops. Drop your theory in the comments. Does the official explanation actually fit the evidence? Or does it sound like someone's contractor did a really bad job and they've been covering it up for 150 years? Asking for a civilization. When you line up the timelines and the systematic erasure of documentation, it stops looking like coincidence. It looks like a reset. Bury the physical evidence, erase the human memory, rewrite the maps, and when someone asks about Tartaria, you point to the archives and say the history is all there. You just need a graduate degree to understand it. It's the bureaucratic equivalent of, I could tell you, but then I'd have to eliminate you. Except instead of eliminating you, they just bore you to expiration with footnotes. Which brings us to the question nobody wants to answer. Why did Tartaria vanish from the maps? The name appears on every major atlas from the 16th through the early 19th century, covering Central Asia, Siberia, Mongolia, Manchuria, millions of square miles. Then, in the late 1800s, it's gone. Except the transition wasn't gradual, it was abrupt. One generation of maps shows Tartaria. The next shows Russia and China. No intermediate stage, just a complete replacement. It's the cartographic equivalent of a find and replace function. Control F, Tartaria, replaced with nothing to see here. So why now? The theory didn't originate in the West. It came from Russian researchers in the 1970s. Anatoly Fomenko developed his new chronology, arguing that conventional historical timelines are wrong. Nikolai Levashov added elements related to ancestral claims, so fringe that even the people who believe in psychic bears thought it was a bit much. Then, around 2016, the theory migrated to the Western internet: TikTok, YouTube, Reddit, Instagram. Hashtag Tartaria has 300 million views. Hashtag Mudflood has 150 million views. Because the buildings are still here. The digital explosion happened because the evidence is visual. You don't need to read archival documents, you just look at your city hall, the basement windows, the ornamental details, the scale, then compare it to what they claim was built with horses. The cognitive dissonance is immediate. The official story requires you to trust institutions. The alternative requires you to trust your eyes. Turns out people trust their own eyeballs more than a dusty archive guarded by someone named Jeffrey with 3 PhDs and 0 social skills. The conspiracy theory calls it antiquitech. So every fancy building decoration is secretly a power antenna. Your local courthouse isn't ostentatious. It's just trying to harvest free energy. Nothing screams covert energy operation like a 40-foot gilded dome visible from space. Spires, domes, finials, reinterpreted as functional. Antennas harvesting atmospheric energy. The mercury used in gilding wasn't just for aesthetics. It was a conductive element. The buildings weren't just structures. They were power stations, part of a global energy grid. Then the system was destroyed, the knowledge suppressed, and we were sold fossil fuels and electrical cables as progress. The official explanation is vertical emphasis and bell housing. The alternative is energy collection. So either our ancestors were really into expensive lawn ornaments at building scale, or they knew something we don't. Here's what the architectural historians tell you. Finials were for waterproofing and lightning protection. Spires housed bells or clocks. Domes created interior space. Mercury gilding protected metal from corrosion. Every element has a documented function. They've been copy-pasting this explanation since 1895. It's the original Wikipedia article. The archives contain millions of blueprints showing exactly how these structures were designed. The construction records exist, the receipts exist, the casualty records exist. That's the official answer, and it's backed by documentation. But here's the problem. It requires you to accept that a civilization using horses built structures that modern contractors with laser levels struggle to replicate. It requires you to believe construction took 30 years not because the technology was inadequate, but because people worked slower. It requires you to accept that the burial of city blocks, mass relocation of children, destruction of World's Fair architecture, and cartographic erasure of Tartaria are all unrelated coincidences, which is a lot of coincidences, like lottery-winning lightning strike on your birthday levels of coincidence. So the proof is in archives you'll never read, guarded by experts whose careers depend on you believing them. That's not evidence. That's a trust me bro with a PhD. If we had the technology and the skills, why did we collectively decide to start building concrete shoeboxes instead? Did everyone just wake up one day and say, you know what? Beauty is overrated? The psychological driver behind the Tartaria theory isn't ignorance. It's aesthetic discontent. Walk through a modern city. Look at the concrete boxes, the glass rectangles. Then look at a 19th-century city hall. The carved stone, the ornamental details. The contrast is violent. We used to build beauty. Now we build functions. We went from cathedrals to parking garages. That's not progress. That's architectural depression. The alternative explanation is that we lost the knowledge. We didn't stop building ornately because we chose to. We stopped because we couldn't anymore. The skill wasn't ours to begin with. We inherited it. Then we lost it. The theory went viral. 300 million views. Maybe because telling people trust the experts while simultaneously building hideous concrete blocks isn't the compelling argument they think it is. But there's a darker current beneath the aesthetics. The Tartaria theory intersects with other conspiratorial narratives. The Great Replacement theory. The Great Reset theory. If history is fabricated, then institutions are lying. If institutions are lying, then everything is suspect. And if everything is suspect, then any alternative becomes plausible. This is the sociological danger. Not that people believe in Tartaria specifically, but that they believe the entire historical record is negotiable. If maps can be rewritten, if empires can be erased, if architecture can be misattributed, then nothing is certain. The Tartaria theory isn't dangerous because it's wrong. It's dangerous because it teaches people to distrust documentation, expert analysis, and verifiable evidence. It's the gateway conspiracy. Today you're questioning basement windows. Tomorrow you're buying non-perishable food and building a bunker. Here's the question they don't want you to ask. If the official story is so obviously true, why does it require a graduate degree to understand it? And why does the alternative explanation that we inherited these buildings make intuitive sense to 300 million people? The blueprints exist, the receipts exist, but so do the basements with windows, the impossible construction speeds, the systematic destruction of ornate architecture, the earth-moving projects that buried city blocks, the child relocation programs that erased family histories, the cartographic disappearance of an empire. You can believe the archives, or you can believe your eyes. But you can't explain why a civilization that supposedly built these structures with horses immediately stopped building anything remotely similar. We didn't lose the skill, we lost the inheritance. And the 19th century wasn't a construction boom, it was a renovation project. They weren't building, they were remodeling. And apparently they lost the contractors' number halfway through. If this investigation disturbed your reality, share it. Let's make people uncomfortable together. Because the only thing better than questioning your entire understanding of architectural history is dragging your friends into the existential crisis with you. They'll thank you later. Probably. The question isn't whether Tartaria existed. It's on the maps. The question is why it disappeared. Why does the architecture look older than the tools? Why city blocks got buried? Why did the children get relocated? Why the world's fairs burned? The buildings are too good. The timelines are too fast. The coincidences are too coordinated. The archives will tell you one story. Your city hall will tell you another. One of them is lying. And the uncomfortable truth is that the liars have credentials and documentation. But they don't have buildings. Those are still here, showing basement windows designed for ground floors and craftsmanship. Modern technology can't match. The official history says we built these structures. The physical evidence says we inherited them. The reset wasn't a mud flood. It was a memory flood. But hey, at least we have the archives. And Jeffrey will explain everything, eventually. The buildings aren't going anywhere. Neither are the questions, but the answers are buried under 50 feet of earth and 150 years of very confident explanations. The archives will tell you one story, your eyes will tell you another. Choose wisely, or don't choose at all. Jeffrey's still on his lunch break anyway.